really privileged to be here and very honored to be able to speak at this forum. I'm Lauren Lin, and so sorry my voice is not in its best today, but so excuse my voice, and I'll try my best. So my topic, so this research is really about looking into how U.S. mutual fund vote in Chinese companies in light of this geopolitical tension between the U.S. And China. So the motivation is really stemmed from the rising geopolitical competition between U.S. and China, and the U.S. wanted to financially decoupling from China. So the U.S. Congress actually did a report investigating into how many, like U.S. mutual funds invest in Chinese companies. And what they found is that, including BlackRock and Vanguard, they invested over $3.9 billion in Chinese companies that had been blacklisted for national security reason. Okay, so and in the past 2 years, actually a bill has been put in the Congress trying to exclude Chinese companies from the index. So it's against this background. I'm curious to know, since we know that they invest in Chinese companies, so how do they vote in Chinese companies, and whether their votes represent the U.S. investors' interests, and whether that align with the U.S. national policy. So quickly to my research question. So I'm asking how they vote in Chinese companies. What are the factors that determine the vote, and also whether they vote in the interest or financial interest of the fund beneficiaries or for their own commercial interest, like in the U.S. And the empirical strategy is to focus on a very specific charter amendment agenda that is, at the request of CCP, Chinese Communist Party, they want the companies to establish an in-house CCP party committee within the company. So the structure, so in the past, if you have some knowledge on the Chinese corporate governance, Chinese companies operated under a dual governance system where they have this board of directors, shareholders exactly look like a Western company, but in the shadow, there is a CCP party committee which control over the business decision and also the personnel decision of the company, and that's for the SOE, most of the SOEs. So this has been in the dark in the past. But since 2016 and 2017, there's a party building reform, under the President Xi's term. CCP requires company to formally establish this party committee and write that into the corporate charter. So me and Curtis has a paper looking into what type of companies do that and what are their characteristics. So in order to do this charter amendment, we lawyers know that you need 2/3 of the vote, right, at the shareholders meeting. And you might say that, U.S. mutual funds, they only own minority shares in these companies, so their vote doesn't matter, right? No matter what they vote, the agenda will be passed, okay? Which is true, they are minority shareholder. However, you need to know the characteristics of this specific agenda, because this is highly political sensitive, and CCP wanted to be, show to the world that, this is we have a whole support from the SOEs, okay, and also other companies. So high passing rate can signal policy success and also signal political loyalty from the company. Okay, so this becomes a high stake amendment, and CCP. So my previous research shows that CCP has been lobbying foreign investors, even though they might not change the vote result, but they has been lobbying foreign investors, hoping to gain their support. So So that's why it's also very interesting to look at, how this U.S. mutual fund votes. So in order to do this, I subscribe the ISS voting to analytics. So for the CCP amendment agenda specifically, I have 24,556 votes by U.S. mutual funds. The sample includes companies enlisted in mainland and Hong Kong across 5 years, 2018 to 2022. So the dependent variable I'm looking at is really whether they support or not, and also the approval rate on a fund family level. Okay, so say for example, BlackRock's approval rate, Vanguard's approval rate. The independent variables I'm looking at, of course, I include ISS recommendation, and some firm characteristics and also some fund characteristics. For example, is it China-focused fund, is it passive funds or ESG funds? And from the literature, we might have different hypotheses about how they will vote. Okay, so anyone want to take a guess? What's the recommendation of ISS on this agenda? ISS generally recommend voting against for governance reasons. Well, they said that because this party committee members are not elected by the shareholders. They are actually appointed by the party. So there's accountability issue, okay? And also there's transparency issue because it's not clear what their role is in the company. Of course, there are various provisions that they can adopt. And in most non-SOEs, they only adopt what we call the symbolic provision, which is they said that, okay, we will provide financial support. So we will pay for party activities, okay? But for a lot of the SOEs, they will adopt one step further on the decision-making provision. So usually it's called prior consultation provision. So they will say that, okay, before the board make material decisions, they need to consult with the party committee. They didn't say that it's subject to their approval, but it's a consultation, okay? So hence there could be influence, all right? So there's accountability issue, and the party might exert disproportionate influence over the board. So ISS recommended to vote against. What about the mutual funds, right? What about the big three? Okay, what about BlackRock? So my data shows that State Street and Vanguard, they basically follow ISS. They vote against in all the companies, but BlackRock supports in 75% of their votes. Okay, and for all funds, including BlackRock, the average is 16%. So you can see that BlackRock really acted differently from others. Okay, this is the BlackRock exceptionalism that I'm talking about. Now, if you look at the number of votes, BlackRock, Vanguard, I highlight the big three. They voted around, 3,000 times. The rest, of course, if you look down, Charles Schwab, the support rate is pretty high, but they only voted 178 times. Okay, so my focus is on the big three. Now, if you compare BlackRock approval rate over the years, the top one is BlackRock. The red one is others. So the approval rate actually dropped in 2022. Okay, if we differentiate SOE, it's voted on SOEs and non-SOEs. Maybe you will say that it makes sense to support SOEs because they are controlled by the CCP anyways. But note that BlackRock's vote in 2022 also dropped to 82%, okay? And we will find out why. And its support for non-SOEs somehow dropped dramatically. So the average is around 27%. So I run a regression to find out what factors would determine. Of course, no surprise for non-BlackRock funds, ISS recommendation is the determining factor. And for BlackRock, it's interesting that they support firms that are state-owned, cross-listed, and large firms, and more profitable firms. And it's interesting that if you look at the leverage, BlackRock actually voted against if a firm have high leverage ratio. Now, my interpretation is that, these firms are highly financially vulnerable, right? If you added a additional political control that would influence their business decision, and they might need to, for example, invest in a project, under the One Belt, One Road initiative, which might not be profitable, okay? So they voted against. So from the regression, it seems that BlackRock has a voting strategy, and they are making informed decisions. You can say that. But whether they are voting for the financial interests of the company, of the investors. Now, my previous event study shows that the market reaction to the party building amendment, it's mixed, okay? In the short term, it's negative cars, but in the long term, it seems that it's beneficial to the SOEs or those who have existing strong political ties. So what explains BlackRock exceptionalism? I decided to interview the team, and it's not easy to get them to get interview with me. And so I interviewed the team. Actually, it's based in Singapore. They have an Asia team in charge of the proxy voting in Chinese companies. So they told me that, well, because they have this local presence, they know the company and they do engagement with the company. So they thought that if voting no would harm their future engagement and their relationship with the company. And plus that they think that it's adding transparency for SOEs. And there's another very interesting reason they told me is that they said that since the state will enforce the adoption anyways, it would be futile for them to vote no, then why not just support it, okay? And just a disclaimer, they said that they didn't support non-SOEs, but my data shows otherwise. Okay, so that doesn't explain or give us the answer of whether their voting is for the financial interests of the company, of the investors, right? So I decided to do an event study to check on that. So BlackRock, quickly on the event study, these are the firms that BlackRock supports. And it seems that you can look at the minus 30 and minus 20 ones. Those are when the board make the announcement. That period, it seems that it's negative card. And for BlackRock voting against, it's also negative, and it's a greater economic magnitude. So it seems that preliminary evidence shows that, this amendment is not to the financial interest of the investor. So what could be other reasons? And I think that it could be their commercial interest in the Chinese market, and they wanted to gain market access to the Chinese market. So what happened is that in 2018, when Trump's first term, he initiated this U.S. and China trade war. And during that time, Chinese government actually asked some Wall Street leaders to negotiate, help the Chinese government to negotiate a deal. And Larry Fink, who is the CEO of BlackRock, actually involved in this. And Chinese government said that, if there is a deal, then we can consider opening our financial market. And Larry Fink actually has publicly said in the media that they wanted to access to the China's 14 trillion asset management market. So the goal is to obtain this first wholly foreign-owned enterprise license in the domestic market. And I think our data is consistent with this timeline because in January 2020, U.S.-China reached the phase 1 deal out of the trade war. And on April 1st, the Chinese government said that, okay, we're opening up the application for the wholly foreign-owned mutual fund license. And on the day, BlackRock applied. And BlackRock is the first one to get the license. And in June 2021, they launched the first fund, I think raising like 1 billion renminbi. So since the launch of the fund, their support drops. That's my explanation. So from this research, I show that there are two layers of incentive misalignment. One is very similar to the corporate client conflict in the US. It's just that, it changes to the deference to the state in a state capitalism. The layer 2 is the geopolitical misalignment. So I think we can all think about, whether BlackRock's vote is aligned with the U.S. interests and U.S. investors' interest or their preferences, right? And aligned with the U.S. national policy. So I think my time's up, and I'll stop here. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for the organizers, and especially the home institution that worked really hard to make this event happen. So the paper, we have some discussions here about papers that fit today's conference, paper that may work 5 years from now. So maybe 5 years from now, there will be a paper about why did BlackRock, if you look at the Wall Street Journal today, wanted to acquire $5 billion of SpaceX. But this is not the paper today. The paper today is about BlackRock operations in China. And I think, as you could see from Lauren's presentation, it nicely combines many of the themes that I think almost all people here care about. And also BlackRock, which is also fun to read about and ask questions about. So the paper starts with the notion of geopolitics and tensions, and then uses that to ask the questions, are fund sponsors guided solely by the interest of their beneficiaries, or are they affected by their own profit-maximizing interests? And in order to do that, Lauren relies on data on U.S. mutual funds voting at Chinese companies, Hong Kong and mainland China. She focuses on specific set of proposals which are interesting for our purposes because we assume that the government, as you just heard, really cares about those proposals being adopted. And she also interviews BlackRock stewardship team and runs a couple of regressions, more than a couple. And she finds divergence between the different big three members, striking differences. She also finds that the approval rate or the support rate of BlackRock has changed over time, especially after it got the permission to start its operations in China. She also finds that those proposals probably overall have a negative price effect, but they are more pronounced for firms at which BlackRock actually voted against. And I have three types of comments. One is kind of more internal to the paper, and that's trying to push harder on the question whether the evidence that is presented in the paper actually provides compelling evidence that BlackRock is guided by its own business interests, or what could be done in order to be more convincing on this point. And the two other points are, is it really about geopolitics, or is it about something close but maybe not precisely geopolitics? And is this something that happens only in China, or maybe a theme that we haven't heard about a lot? There's going to be some convergence with other jurisdictions. So this is just a list of kind of minor points that could be asked about the first question: do we know from the evidence that's really about BlackRock's own interest, and it's not for the interest of its own beneficiaries? So let's focus on several of those points. So one, as was mentioned, is that institutional investors, and I assume that the U.S. mutual funds within the group of those investors have a smaller fraction, are minority shareholders. That means that they know that they're not going to have an impact. So it may be the case that the government cares about their votes, but they know that they're not going to have an impact. And that raises the question of what really happens when investors know that they're not going to have an impact. They could vote almost for, they could maybe, but Vanguard and the others are doing precisely the same thing. They just adopt a policy, one size fits all, and don't focus on that. We don't really know. One strategy to try to see how this works, and I don't know if this data exists, is do something that Yair did in one of his studies, look at close votes and see whether close votes affect or look differently than other votes. The other question arises from the fact that BlackRock, unlike Vanguard and State Street, varies its votes across different types of companies. One notable difference is between state-owned enterprises and other entities. Now, if we think that the reason why BlackRock supports the government or the proposals is not because it has business ties with a specific company level, is that because it wants to please the Chinese government, then that kind of motivation, which allegedly is very powerful, has equal force both at state-owned enterprises and maybe even, from the little that I know, stronger perhaps at companies that are not state-owned enterprises. And I think this is also something that needs to be discussed to make it more convincing. The changes over time, so the theory in the paper is that BlackRock level of support has declined once it got clearance to start operations in the Chinese market. But again, to make that a convincing explanation for why it might have led BlackRock to change its vote, we need to be convinced that it's going to be difficult for the Chinese government to change its policy, right? To say, okay, now that you're here, it's going to be difficult for us to reverse our policy and kick you out. If we think that the Chinese government has the same power both to give you clearance to operate at the outset and then maybe act in a retributive way against you, then this shouldn't be a convincing explanation for why they changed their vote. Other kind of different pieces from the paper is that even with respect to other votes, there seems to be some variance between BlackRock and the others. BlackRock seems to be more supported. This is a quote supportive of management. This is a quote from the paper. Maybe there's something there to the extent that those are not related to the Chinese government that tells us about something, how BlackRock operates. And finally, I just want to pause on several points from the interview. So one is the access to management point. And this is a point that has nothing to do with geopolitics. This is a point that always comes up when we think about institutional investors and how they vote, and hasn't been explored in sufficient depth. Jill and I mentioned it with Stephen in the paper that we wrote together. Sometimes the conflict is that the stewardship team wants to keep its access to management. Now, that can be consistent with investor interest to the extent that you have an active fund that actually benefits from the fact that you have access to management. It may be inconsistent with investor interest if you're a passive fund that also have an active fund and you kind of use your influence from the passive side to kind of make money on the active side. But the engagement story by itself, I think, is more complicated and could be, in some circumstances, convincing. And another way to kind of put a more kind of legitimate face to the explanation is to say, if you have local presence, you may benefit, again, if you're an active fund, you may benefit the fund by having more knowledge about what's going on at the company and the environment and so on, but it makes you also more susceptible to pressure. So maybe the government can exert influence on the local stewardship team and not necessarily on BlackRock as a whole. So this is one comment. The two others, very quickly. Is it really about geopolitics? Is it really about the tension between the US and China with BlackRock in between? I think the story here, one could say it's not really geopolitics because maybe today there are more tensions and maybe later there were more concerns about these investments, but at least here we only have one side that kind of pushes or applies pressure, and that's the Chinese government. So maybe it's a story about business ties, right? It's like insiders have some business ties with institutional investors, and many people in the room have discussed this concern. There are no ties between BlackRock and corporate insiders, but the government, in essence, one way to think about what's going on here, kind of makes itself some sort of a stakeholder with respect to this specific proposal, and it has, through its regulatory arm, kind of the ability to apply pressure on the business of the institutional investors. But one could say it's not really about business ties, it's more about politics, and in fact what we're seeing here is that the government can exert political pressure over asset managers. And again, in the literature about asset managers, there are stories that say they act because of concern about political retribution, even in the States. And maybe what happens here is that the government, it's kind of a new form of a conflict that's not really about geopolitics, but it's about what happens when the government really cares about an issue, cares about an issue, and we know that the government can exert power as the regulator to kind of put the institutional investors in this conflict between either you use your stewardship power in the way that we like, or you're going to suffer on the regulatory side. So if this is the case, is it unique to China? And maybe we should be optimistic because there is convergence after all. We could say, well, to some extent, this is what happened with ESG and the Green Retreat in the United States. You know, it started with the states, the red states, that said we don't like what the big three and other investors are doing on climate and on ESG. And there were, like, at the state level, different measures taken, anti-ESG legislation, and that's like another type of a conflict because some of this legislation was about the role of the states as clients and using that as leverage. And one could think about kind of a future that's becoming more and more of the present, where the government, and here talking about the US government, but maybe other governments, the more they engage in what could be called the new industrial policy, you can call it state capitalism, you can call it crony capitalism, everyone with the examples that he or she has in mind. But once the government becomes more and more interested in the stewardship activities of institutional investors, then we end up with this paper being just example to many other types of conflicts that could emerge. And maybe in CGCG in 2028, you'll see Dorothy presenting the paper that she and he are writing precisely about kind of the general problem of the government and especially the US executive branch using its power to try to affect stewardship policies of US institutional investors. So it's a great paper, and we're definitely going to cite it, going back to Roy's point from earlier. Thank you.
Thank you, Assaf, for the comments and suggestions. So definitely I will look more into, like you suggested, the close votes and see maybe more in specific cases, you know, like how much like BlackRock owns in specific companies and how that, you know, whether they are critical in those votings. But I suspect that, you know, they should own very minor shares in the companies. And also why market entry matters, while you can say that there are a lot of other reasons, but it's just, you know, I'm just trying to show that they have a strong commercial interest in the Chinese market, and that could be the reason. And we do see a drop in the support rate once they got the license. So I think it's very hard to do like causal inference here, like, you know, this is the reason, and BlackRock will not tell me that, you know, this is the reason. They will say, no, this has nothing to do with our business interests in China, okay? And whether this is geopolitics or or not. And I agree with you that it's about politics, and I appreciate your relate that to the U.S. situation. But I do think that it's my analogy would be it's similar to the U.S. corporate client conflict, where they defer to the managers for business opportunities. And here they defer to the Chinese government because Chinese government is not only the largest shareholders, they are also the regulators in the Chinese market. So it's very similar to the deference to managers. And here they defer to, the most powerful shareholders and regulators in China. Yeah. So thank you very much for the comments.
Yes, thanks, Lauren, for the very exciting paper. I have one question. I think I do agree with Assaf's point that political pressure does play a part, but I believe that in this case, the political pressure would be, if there is, it will be equal among all the three big asset managers. And I was wondering, when you interviewed the team in BlackRock, did you look at the composition? Were they Chinese? I'm just wondering. Yeah, the team. Were they Chinese? So, so maybe composition of the team that advises whether you should follow Chinese politics or what does play a part. I mean, I'm just proposing a hypothesis. Yep.
I think this is a very interesting study, and I think by looking at how BlackRock votes differently from the other two large U.S. Asset managers, you're really able to tease out a lot. And I think your quid pro quo story fits very well with some research I have done that is very consistent with what you're finding. So this is research looking at the entire portfolio of BlackRock and the carbon footprint of that portfolio. And what you find is that the overall global BlackRock portfolio footprint, carbon footprint, is lower than the market carbon footprint. So it suggests that globally, BlackRock is tilting away from companies with high carbon emissions. Okay, that's the first finding. The second finding is if you separate the companies that are US-based from foreign companies, you find that the US portfolio of BlackRock, if anything, tilts more towards companies that have high emissions. And where they do all the negative screening, it's abroad. So it reveals a lot about how BlackRock actually conducts its business. It's very much in line with your quid pro quo analysis. And the last example I want to mention is Google and Microsoft. What was Microsoft prepared to do that Google wasn't prepared to do?
So yeah, so a super interesting paper. I guess an interesting point, Lin and I have a paper from a few years back that shows that, and we just really put together the data, but institutional investors have grown enormously. From 2003, they made up 2% of the market in China as a whole, institutional investors, and they grew to almost 25% and almost 50% of the free float. But what's fascinating is that foreign institutional investors make up a minuscule portion. 97 to 98% are Chinese institutional investors. So in other words, BlackRock, State Street, the big three and all others have failed to capture the market. The explanation for that is not surprising until 2020, because until 2020, the Chinese government, as I'm sure you know, put caps on, so you had to apply as a foreign institutional investor, and that was by design to actually grow the domestic market. But since 2020, they've entirely lifted the caps, which means that there's no prohibition anymore, as I'm sure you know, on foreign institutional investors to take a share of the market. the question I have for you, I guess, is twofold. One is, does this mean that BlackRock is smart or stupid? They've obviously made a business play right here, and the other large institutional investors have decided not, if I'm following your story, right? They weren't able to capture the market before. It doesn't seem they're capturing a large slice now, or empirically they are not. That would suggest that this is a miscalculation, and the others were right. The second question, though, which is, I think, more critical, is if they're voting in favor to impress the Chinese government, what are they expecting the Chinese government to do? Because they've already lifted the cap. It's already a free market in terms of being able to invest. So what's the suggestion that if they impress the Chinese government, what are you expecting that they'll get back from that? Because from a regulatory point of view, the cap was lifted in 2020.
Dan asked a much better version of the question that I was going to ask, which is, had BlackRock behaved in this way in order to permit U.S. investors the potential for greater access to Chinese investment? And I take it that Dan's point is, after the lifting of the cap, that wouldn't have been a factor. So we're back to the story that you're telling about the BlackRock ability to act in a domestic way rather than as a funnel for U.S. and other investors to have access to Chinese investment.
All right, thank you. I'll answer the last question first about Jeff and Dan's point. I think then what you're talking about, the 2020 is the lift on the foreign investment cap. And it's not on all companies, but here I'm talking about another difference is the wholly foreign-owned license, mutual fund license. So in the past, if you want to do mutual fund business in China, you need to do joint venture. You cannot, come in as a wholly foreign-owned company. That's the lift in 2020. Yeah. So and that's actually comes out of the U.S.-China trade war, the Phase 1 deal, and they agreed to open up the domestic mutual fund market. So I think it's a different thing versus their investment in the company. I'm talking about the license to open up a wholly foreign-owned mutual fund, offering mutual fund products to domestic investors. Okay, that's a quick answer. So for the voting team, Lulu's point, yeah, the voting team actually, they are based in Singapore, and they also have, from what I know, they have 2 people in Hong Kong as well. So they are local. You can say they are Chinese, they are from Hong Kong, or they are from Singapore. I'm not really sure, but they are ethnically Chinese. So I'm not sure if it's. I think it's more of because they said that they know the company well, so they would support this kind of initiative. And the point that you make about like the other 2, Vanguard and State Street, they are facing the same pressure. Why don't they, support? Well, I guess that's my point, is that they don't have an ambition in tapping into the domestic mutual fund market in China. They're owning Chinese companies' stocks is mainly because they are issuing this index fund that the index include Chinese companies. So they are very passive on like trying to engage with the Chinese companies and all that. They are owning the stock is because it's by the index. So that's my quick response. And to your point, I definitely want to look at your paper on comparing the U.S. And also the their voting in the U.S. and also the global companies. And I also wanted to look into, their other votings in Chinese companies. And I think that would be a very interesting topic to discuss.
You show a reciprocal, you allege a reciprocal relationship here, so market access for something else. You could look in other countries. We know that they received something in Saudi Arabia. They got market access in Saudi Arabia. So those would be jurisdictions where you could look whether they received something, where we actually don't know what that something would be. It could be the same thing as here. Maybe they're
You had a paper
always
on that,
in favor
the Saudi Arabia?
No, you could have a paper on it.
Oh, okay.
Thank you, Lauren. What a great project. I have two quick questions. One is, I didn't fully understand whether BlackRock's vote really made the difference, whether they made the difference in voting or not. Because if no is the answer, then why should the Chinese government care? I mean, so that's the quid pro quo story, right? What did the Chinese government get out of it that they would then compensate and honor, right? And that's the first question. And the second one is, I understood they got this license eventually, but what about State Street and Vanguard and the others? Did they fail to get the same license? In other words, did BlackRock really achieve something out of this behavior that the others didn't get? I mean, that would be the other follow-up question.
Okay, thank you. So why do the Chinese government care? Now, if you're in China, you will not doubt that they care. Because if you look at the passing rate, I had a previous paper, look at the passing rate of the party committee agenda versus others. The party committee agenda, the passing rate is way higher than others. It's almost 99%. So they care, and they wanted to show that, everyone supports this agenda. And that's important. And that's important for companies as well, because they need to achieve that, the support rate in order to show the government that we are in support of this policy. And it's important in China. So with regard to the Vanguard and State Street, so why didn't they? Because they don't care about Chinese market. They have different business strategy. They do not intend to tap into the local Chinese market. So I have a section actually in my paper talking about their different business strategy. So we can discuss more in the break.
Thank you. So this is really interesting. I really enjoyed the presentation. And your explanation certainly seems plausible to me, but I'm just wondering whether you dismiss too readily the more BlackRock generous explanation that they do genuinely believe that CCP involvement with portfolio companies is actually value enhancing. I know the kind of short-term market reaction is, I think you say negative, but maybe BlackRock just buys a longer-term story, which is that the rest of the market doesn't get, that actually having CCP engagement with, involvement in one of their portfolio companies is in the longer term likely to generate some value for the shareholders in that company. And that also seems to me like a plausible reason for supporting the amendment.
Hi. I think I just want to push you a little bit on articulating why the focus is on the big three and not some of the other managers that you have on there. Because I think when you broaden that lens and you compare BlackRock's voting to other managers, there's more levels. There are high levels of support from Charles Schwab or whoever else, and there's a world in which that should be the important question: is like the managers that have a higher fraction of active management are likely to be more informed, more sophisticated, devoting more resources to voting. So if BlackRock is actually voting along the lines of those asset managers, or at least there's a reason to complicate the story.
So, if I may suggest one more way to corroborate your story, why didn't you also interview the stewardship teams of the other two? Simply because that would just lend more credibility to your idea that they are pursuing a different business model and therefore they vote differently. Because even if they pursue, because it's not entirely intuitive to me, that even if you have a different business model which does not try to dive deep into the Chinese market. Why do you piss off the regulators by the vote that they obviously don't like? I mean, it doesn't matter. Okay, fine, but it's symbolic. So I would like to have some evidence on what was driving them and why they did it in order to contrast that with the BlackRock voting.
Sorry, I think this sort of follows on that point. I was struck by your finding in the interviews, Lauren, that the BlackRock people said they did not vote in favor of these amendments for POEs, and yet you found that they did. That suggests some level of misunderstanding or obfuscation about what they were doing. And I just wondered, these committees are what they actually do is quite mysterious and not well known. There's surveys showing that foreign investors don't even know that these committees exist, et cetera. So I'm just curious, how well do you think that they actually understood what they were voting for? And did you break down the votes by type of amendment? Our paper breaks out the type of amendment into 8 different categories. It's very complicated. Some of them have virtually no meaning for corporate governance. Others are, very substantive. So I didn't see, maybe I just missed this, but did you show a breakdown of votes by type of amendment? Because that would suggest that they actually understood at some level what they were voting for. So I'm just curious whether you got a sense that they really knew what they were voting for in this case.
Okay. Hi. I'm just curious. You think there is only one way for the quid pro quo? I think there are many ways in which the Chinese government can help BlackRock. So BlackRock can help Chinese government in this voting, but Chinese government, for example, can invest through BlackRock, right? I think the CIC actually they do invest through BlackRock. They get mandates from the Chinese government to invest outside of China, and that's a huge contract. That's probably even more profitable than having the license to operate in China, which may or may not be profitable because of the various regulatory burdens. So I'm not sure why you're only looking at this specific quid pro quo, because there are many ways the Chinese government can benefit BlackRock.
One last question. After they get approval to operate alone in China, one possibility is they're now trying to appeal to Chinese clients in a different way. And perhaps that may have something to do with the decrease in their approval rate, that it's actually not some reversion to what they would have done before absent geopolitics, but perhaps it's just there's now new customers that they're signaling to.
Thanks very much to all the great questions. I'm sorry we are running out of time, so we have to proceed to the next presentation. Okay. And I'm sure Laura could
I will answer, privately to your questions. Thank you very much.